Good evening to all of you. I think Mr. Sanyal has already joined in. Let me start by, sir, would you please? Yeah, thank you. Good to see you again, sir.
Good to see you.
Yeah. So let me start by welcoming you and thanking you for making the time to be with us today. And all the participants who have taken the time out to join us in this interaction. As we go along, I expect more people to be joining it. So let me just speak about the platform which this is. We are the Indian Revenue Service, Customs and GST. We call ourselves C&IT after the new notification that has come in. This is a platform essentially we have created for all our youngsters and all our officers to get a chance to interact with people from many different disciplines. The idea is to engage on a broad, variety of topics. Some which directly concern us and others which we would be very much interested in as civil servants and as citizens of this country. We have extended the invitation to our sister agencies as well. So there are participants today in this platform from the IAS Association, the Forest Service, from the Income Tax, and from the IPS also. That being said, today's topic is the roadmap to a $5 trillion economy. And the Prime Minister has announced just about a year and a half ago that he is looking to make India by 24-25 into a $5 trillion economy. And if I understand correctly, there was also a working group which was asked to develop a roadmap towards achieving a $5 trillion economy by 2025. And the working group had come up with the sectoral contributions, the target being to achieve $1 trillion from agriculture and allied activities, $1 trillion from manufacturing, and $3 trillion from the services sector. And this time after budget, there have been a lot of good reactions in different news items that we read in the newspapers. And with the projected rate of growth, we are expected to kind of be growing along at somewhere around 11 to 11.5% to be able to reach to the target of being a 5 trillion economy by the set date. And the projections have seemed good so far. But the details on how we expect to get there are not so much known. We, being revenue service, have a fair role to play, we believe, in terms of facilitation, in terms of helping the government, being members of the civil service, in whatever way we could to kind of get to the target. So that being said, I'll just invite Namrata to introduce you.
Good evening, sir. Very good evening to all the respected seniors, CC Customs Shri and Srinivas sir, other senior officers, colleagues, and my dear friends. It gives pleasure to welcome you all to the fifth conversation in the series called Xchange that is organized by the Karnataka Chapter of the IRS Association. Today, we have amidst us Shri Sanjeev Sanyal, Principal Economic Advisor to the Government of India, and it is my honor to introduce him to this august gathering. As Principal Economic Advisor, Sanyal sir provides key inputs to the government on a range of policy matters. He has represented India on prestigious international platforms like the G20, OECD, amongst others, as a key interlocutor. Shri Sanyal has done his BA Honours in Economics from Shri College of Commerce, Delhi, followed by an MA and then MSc in Economics from the Oxford University. He has worked as an economist at Societe Generale and Deutsche Bank, where he was a global strategist and a managing director. Sanyal sir has published around 150 papers, articles, and columns in leading national and international publications. He has co-authored 3 editions of the Economic Survey of India. He is also well known for his many books which have achieved great popularity, like The Indian Renaissance, India's Rise After 1,000 Years of Decline, and Brief History of India's Geography. We now welcome sir to share his thoughts on the topic Resurgent India, Roadmap to a $5 trillion economy.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Namrata, for the very kind introduction. What I will do is what I'll do is take you through the philosophical framework of some of the way we think about it, how we dealt with the COVID crisis recently. And you will see this is, to some extent, also explain the way we think about going forward. Since I'm partly responsible for inflicting that $5 trillion target, let me say that, first of all, you need to think about this significantly differently than, say, the old 5-year plan way of thinking of targets. So, this idea of having properly boxed up, agriculture will do this much and so sector will do this much. Frankly, I have some difficulty with that. So you need to take that with many pinches of salt. In fact, a fistful of salt. Because much of what we are dealing with is how do you respond to uncertainty of the future. World is always uncertain and it's nothing new. And if you needed any convincing of that, hopefully the last 1 year has convinced you that it's all about dealing with random shocks, butterfly effects, and so on. It's not about having these Soviet-style 5-year plans, which anyway should be trashed in, put in the trash can. And that is the thinking behind why, for example, the Planning Commission itself was shut down, because it came with the wrong philosophical framework. Sadly, that framework is still deeply seeped into our education system and very often in the bureaucracy, that we want these sort of Soviet kind of planned ideas. And I'm going to try and show you an alternative way of thinking about the world and why we could then use that as being the driving force. And you will see how both the way we dealt with the economic crisis, as well as the kinds of reforms we are now doing, fit into that approach, as opposed to the approach of having nicely, this target approach. That is meant for, frankly, that approach clearly failed in the pre-1991 era. And I don't think anybody is wildly keen on going back in this finely tuned approach to the world, to a master planned approach to economic management. So let me say, what is it that when you're dealing with the world, when you're talking about the future, $5 trillion in the next number of years, remember, the world is continuously going through major changes. The post-COVID world, for example, is fundamentally different than the pre-COVID world. Even if our economies are reinflating and accelerating, it's not like we're returning to whatever we were doing before COVID. We'll have this new world will have its own technologies. It will have its own geopolitics. It will have its own consumer behavior. It will have its own technology, and all these things will all supply chains. All of them will interact with each other. So exactly how these things will move forward is consequently unknown. So how do you deal with radical uncertainty going forward? That is basically what I'm going to talk about, so that you understand where we are coming from. And you will also then begin to see the kinds of reforms we are doing, why we are doing those reforms. So let me illustrate this with the response we did over the last 1 year to the COVID crisis, both for the health and for the economic response. And so you will then immediately see that we have this framework, and we will show you how that plays forward in other fields as well. So if you go back to last March, what was the information that we had about the pandemic? The information that we had was that something very bad had happened in China and had killed a lot of people, but nobody knew what exactly had happened. We still don't know what happened, in fact, in China. We also knew that it had spread to Italy and killed a lot of people there as well. But basically, that was the sum total of all the knowledge that we had. Now, governments around the world obviously had to respond to this. So we all are called in the experts and virus experts, epidemics experts, and they gave you lots of forecasts of what would happen. So there were people who said, look, COVID is not much worse than a bad flu. And there were those who said that hundreds of millions of people will be infected, and millions in India alone would die. We hold the whole range, right? Now, all governments in the world also heard the same thing. Now, if you are into the planning mindset, how do you deal with this? Well, what you do is you try and guess amongst these various forecasts of the experts, which one is the likeliest one, and you bet on it. That is the way, because that gives you at least there is a clear path and you can plan along that way. We, however, took a different message out of this. First of all, we knew that we couldn't change once we had decided whichever path we are going. With 1.35 billion people, you can't change. So you can't do, for example, what the British did. They opted once for herd immunity, they changed their mind. Or you can't go for the Swedish model. They decided on a particular path, or the Singapore or somebody. In each one of their cases, they had opted for a certain path. Some of them had to change their path halfway through, but we knew in India we couldn't do it. The second thing we understood very clearly was, since the experts were telling us so many different things, one thing we understood is they had no clue. That is what we understood out of it, that we were dealing with radical uncertainty. So we didn't waste our time trying to guess which of these particular paths we were going to go down. Instead, we did something that is known in the world of finance as a barbell strategy. So what do you do with barbell strategy is when you basically combine two opposite strategies in order to deal with radical uncertainty. So what did we do? You hedge for the very worst outcomes on one side, and on the other side, you use Bayesian updating to make your way through as better information becomes available. So that is the context, by the way, in which we did the lockdown in the end of March last year. It wasn't that we knew for sure that the worst thing was going to happen or what was going to happen. We had no idea. All we were doing was hedging for the worst and buying time to put in place testing, buying time to put in place some quarantining, buying time to get information from other countries which were further up the cycle. Now, as time passed, we then were able to get more information. So we learned, for example, that not every demographic is equally badly affected, that certain demographics were particularly affected, so we have to look after them. We learned, for example, that you have to watch people's oxygen levels. So, all of us suddenly discovered what an oximeter is, and so on and so on. Now, that allowed us to then slowly be able to make up, as we did, Bayesian updating of information, and we began to move forward. So that is how we have gone about, and it has been a successful strategy. As you can see, we have one of the world's lowest fatality rates. We had one big peak back in September, and since then, infection rates have been declining. And this iterative step-by-step approach has basically worked. But notice how this is fundamentally different from other countries, and many other people's advice of trying to have a preconceived path that we should have taken. Now, also notice that we did exactly the same thing with our response to the economic front. Many people in the beginning may have criticized us that why didn't you try and reinflate the economy? You will remember, Britain, Japan, all these countries had these massive $1 trillion reinflation stimulus packages, whereas India was taking these relatively medium-sized packages and doing them iteratively forward. Because we were doing exactly the same thing. We were hedging for the worst and then step by step through medium-sized packages making our way forward. And here also, in the very first package, if you remember, what were we doing? We were not trying to reinflate the economy. All we were doing was hedging for the very worst, hitting our most vulnerable sections of society. So that is the reason we put in place the world's largest food program. 800 million people were provided with food. Then we provided some money from the Jan Dhan accounts. Now people say, oh, this very little money, how that will not reinflate the economy. Of course it won't. That's not the idea. All we are doing is hedging, cushioning them, safety net. Same thing we are doing with the economic agencies and the economy as well, and the business sector. Basically, what are we doing? We're providing the MSME sector with a safety net by pushing back the deadlines for keeping the IBC, the Insolvency Bankruptcy Code, in abeyance, providing liquidity, giving 100% loan guarantees. What are we doing? This is all safety net, cushioning. We were not making the claim that you can reinflate the economy, because you can't. When you see those countries and those experts who were advocating day in and day out, particularly US-based Indian NRI economists who had all kinds of opinions, about how we should reinflate our economy. My view is, look, this was not purely a demand side problem. Most of the problem was a supply side one, which is that we had shut down the supply side. And so there was no point in pressing the accelerator when we had our foot on the brake. So consequently, only when after September we had our foot off the brake, then we began to press the accelerator. That is when pent-up demand also began to come back. That is when we also began to spend money. And we spent money in very peculiar way. We did not send out stimulus checks. Instead, we began to do capital expenditure. So what is that capital expenditure? If you look at October capital expenditure was 129% up year on year. November was up 249% year on year. December was up 62% year on year. January number isn't out, but it was up again. And so we were basically, we waited, then we began to calibrate it up, step by step. And then it culminated in the presentation of the budget, where we have said that we are committing ourselves over the next 3 years to massive spending. And again, remember where we are spending it on capital expenditure on infrastructure, broadly defined, including health and so on. Why are we doing it this way? Well, because for whatever it's worth, we are going to build up debts from this. So we have to leave behind assets for future generations to match those debts. So we are not being irresponsible, pressing the accelerator, sending out stimulus checks. Other countries are going to discover that they send those stimulus checks. That money, maybe some of them will spend, some will not spend. They have used up their ammunition, and they're going to get very little bang for their buck. Whereas we will get good bang for our buck. In fact, we're already getting it. We have a V-shaped recovery. We are the fastest recovering economy outside of China, and I think we will very quickly begin to see GDP growth levels exceeding what they were before COVID. So while the $5 trillion economy target may have been pushed back a little bit, I don't think we have pushed it back all that much. Now, exactly where is difficult to judge at this moment, but it's not far off, maybe a year or something like that. The second point is, very differently from other countries, we invested very heavily in supply side measures. Again, why are we investing in supply side measures? Every other country is interested in demand management. Why are we doing supply side? Even the infrastructure build out is ultimately, in the short run, it's demand, but in the long run, it creates supply side. So why are we so interested in the supply side? The reason for this is as follows. Because we are entering a completely uncertain post-COVID world, which, as I mentioned, we have no idea how the technologies, geopolitics, supply chains, consumer behavior will be in that world. The most important things you can do for this world is to invest in two things. One is flexibility, and the other is resilience. Again, you can clearly see it's the same broadband strategy. So how are we doing this? So if you look at the reforms we have done over the last 1 year, they are all aimed towards flexibility. We have basically removed dozens of labor laws and introduced a simple 4-code labor code. The idea here is why? This is bringing labor factor market flexibility. We have introduced farm laws and change. Okay, there is obviously pushback against it, but the fact of the matter is, what are we trying to do? We are trying to bring flexibility to the farm sector. We are similarly pushing for privatization. What are we trying to do? We are creating flexibility in the corporate sector by privatizing, because we are trying to remove huge numbers of outdated and utterly ridiculous restrictions on cartography and digital mapping, which we just did day before yesterday. We removed telecom related regulations, equally outdated and not equally outdated. Of course, they were more recent, but still equally absurd. Regulations on the BPO sector and the IT services sector about 2 months ago. So we are trying to deregulate it on a systematic basis. And the intellectual basis of that, by the way, if you read chapter 6 of the economic survey on deregulation, you'll see the intellectual basis of that deregulation. What are we trying to do? Introduce into the system flexibility so that it can deal with different kinds of outcomes which we cannot predict. And we are basically making the case that the adaptable will win against people who are somehow fixated and stuck somewhere. Number one. Number two, we are taking a few calculated bets. Some of them may work, some of them will not work. What are those calculated bets? Those are the PLI schemes. Why? They're trying to create clusters of certain activities. Now, some of them will, as I said, may work, some may not work. But hopefully enough of them will work that creates cluster of activity and creates international. Third thing we are trying to do is to invest in resilience, because that is the equivalent of the cushioning part that we discussed earlier. And that is where Atmanirbhar Bharat comes in. Atmanirbhar Bharat is not some return to pre-1991 import substitution. For God's sake, I have no interest in ever driving an ambassador. Some of you may be fans of them, but I am the son of an IAS officer and I had to suffer them in my childhood, and I have no intentions of ever suffering them again. We need to move forward, but how do we then create resilience for a system when we are buffeted by these shocks? So let me give you an example. We are all very proud of our pharmaceutical sector, right? It's a globally competitive sector, clearly doing very well. However, very early in the cycle, we discovered that it was heavily dependent on a single source foreign supply chain. And therefore, if that single source for whatever reason broke down, the entire pharmaceutical sector was jammed up and would fall apart. So we have decided that we are going to provide a certain amount of protection and support for building up some of these key sectors, key input capacities in India, because if we don't have them, then we are beholden to this single source, which may stop for whatever reason suddenly. Now, providing such support to these key inputs is not import substitution. It is about actually the resilience of a globally successful industry. So that is how we think about it, which is why we are interested in bringing FDI into India. Atmanirbharta does not mean that we don't want foreign companies here or their know-how. Far from it. We encourage more and more of them to come here and build the stuff here so that we learn the technologies, gain the skills and so on. But at the same time, we need to have basic capacities here. It is about resilience. Atmanirbharta ultimately is about resilience, about leveraging our domestic capacities so that we are resilient to the vagaries of uncertainty. So the point I'm making to you is, when we are looking forward, what are we investing in? We are investing in flexibility of factor markets. We are investing in resilience. And this is the context in which we need to invest in an administrative system that is fast to be able to respond to change. So one of the biggest dangers to us under these circumstances is to think of our administration as the steel cage, as a steel frame, because a steel frame is essentially a cage. And we have got to stop thinking of our administration and our bureaucracy as some sort of a steel frame, because it basically is actually very quickly becomes a rusty old cage and restricts the system. And this is the context, by the way, in which we need to begin to think of a administrative system, which includes, of course, even the IRS. But it is the context in which you will see that the statements, for example, made the Prime Minister recently in the Parliament, that is the context you have to see it, because there is a certain amount of frustration in the political leadership or even the higher levels of the bureaucratic leadership, that we have ended up with an administrative structure that is way too rigid and in some ways also antagonistic to the private sector. It somehow has, and this has required a certain amount of cultural change, to begin to think of the private sector as not something that is inherently to be suspicious of, but something that the administrative structure exists in order to protect and to encourage. So this is a culture change that really needs to come through in the administration. And as I said, we may have seen recently several senior members of the political leadership making speeches with a certain tone which you may not like, But it is important that the reality of this has to be understood, where it is coming from, and the system has to begin to adapt to it, because we have this whole approach to dealing with uncertainty, about going forward into an uncertain world and to grab opportunities of that, requires a certain mindset that unfortunately, forget about existing, but is in fact actively discouraged in the philosophical framework in which our administrative structure today exists. I mean, so with that, let me stop, and I'll be happy to answer questions going forward.
So the floor is now open for the questions. You may unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and ask your question. Let me start by asking the first question to you, sir. You have spoken about the COVID black swan event, and it's disruptive in many ways. What are the sectors that we are primarily looking at? In infrastructure, we have invested heavily. There are some legacy, what do you call, corridors of industrial development that we were thinking of doing, like DMCC. But where exactly are we focused, and how we are planning to go about it?
So, first of all, let me say that there are some certain areas, as I said, since we're entering a new world, many new things will happen. We'll have to adapt to that. But there are some things that we can see we will need, at least for the foreseeable future. So, for example, there is a national infrastructure pipeline, but there is identified about 50 major national projects that the Prime Minister's office and the Cabinet Secretariat monitor on a weekly basis. This would include things like, we know, for example, we need the Jewar airport. We know for a fact that we need a new airport in Mumbai. We know that several of the cities require new metro systems. So these are things that we know for a fact will be required, and those are being invested in. Some of these are already spade ready, and so we need to get on with it and invest in these. So that is basically what we are doing. But of course, as with everything, after having lectured everybody about the need of adaptability, we have to be ourselves adaptable to this. At some point in the not too distant future, we will have to adopt 5G technologies. And again, there is a lot of debate worldwide about what particular platform we will use, but we will have to use those.
Good morning. I am Sanjeev, Principal Commissioner from Mysuru GST. Sir, other than the reforms you foresee, it's very essential that there should be reforms at the tax level, both indirect and direct taxes. I just intend to give you a small thought in the whole process. Some 24 lakhs crores we generate through indirect taxes, state and center together. We generate the only cash components makes the tax element part of it. But if you see the ratio, Senvat is another component, that is credit versus the cash. It's almost 20% cash and 80% Senvat. So it means that out of the 100 rupees, what government gets is only 20 rupees. 80 rupees is the credit adjusted. And especially, this ratio is totally inverted if you see some sectors like iron and steel, textile, plastics. This is almost 5 to 7 to 93%. So Sanjeev plays a very important role. The second part is that 90% of litigation in the indirect taxes is because of this Sanjeev element. The rest 10% are classification, valuation, and other things. So this Sanjeev element, which we have not managed to deal with, and the distorted ratio, this has to be seen. For example, recently we have a drive of almost for the last 2.5 months, and we detected 20,000 crores of evasion through the fake invoices. Out of these 20,000 crores, 90% pertains to the iron and steel sector, the scrap dealers and all those things. So in 2.5 months, we detected 20,000 crores of fake invoices. That is other than illegal, availment of credit through other forum. This is the extent of this. So why not have a system, which is devoid of SENVAT? We say that cascading effects and other things are there. If you see the other countries, not many countries, not all countries are using SENVAT they're applying the VAT phenomena as a SENVAT intake. If we curb down SENVAT, government in various schemes like compounded levy scheme on this basis, capacity building basis, on iron steel has imposed, or there's a tariff value, everything. So I think, sir, this is a SENVAT issue which hampers the litigation part and which hampers the exaction of the revenue. If some tax model, the government can think of that, I think there will be tremendous buoyancy of the revenue.
So let me say, I don't know enough about this particular SENVAT thing because you know a lot about it, and so will I think most of the audience. So I can't really educate you about a specific item. But let me say as an overall point that, by the way, if you get me a short note on this SENVAT thing and explain it to me, I'll try and get it changed. So if somebody can come and explain exactly what the problem is, if Mr. Pant, you will yourself do it, I will be happy to have a look at it and try and solve the underlying issue and try and see what I can do about it. But let me say, there is a philosophical problem that we need to also deal with, which, by the way, is there in chapter 6 in the economic survey deals with this. You see, there is a philosophical problem that the more complex a system or a country or thing, the more complex the tax system should be to deal with it, because we need to be able to deal with every possible outcome that the more complex the system becomes, we have to deal with more and more outcomes, and consequently the tax system has to become more and more complex in order to deal with these particular outcomes. I have actually the exact opposite view on this matter. The more complex the system, the simpler the administrative rules and regulations to deal with them. So, whenever I say, why can't we have a system as simple as Singapore's tax system? People will say, no, Singapore is a small, simple country, therefore we cannot have a simple system. I actually have the opposite view. A simple country like Singapore can actually have a complicated tax system. Complicated country like India can only have a very simple tax system. So I am totally of the view that we need a radically simple tax system. And if you are saying that this one thing is causing so many troubles, I'm happy to look at it and model it. Obviously, we need to be clear that if you change this, what it will do to the rest of the system, I don't know. So we will have to work that out, because it may just shift the complication to some other part of the system. So you have to be very careful not to play that game. But my general point is that this is a major problem with our entire tax system or our entire regulatory system. We need to have an extremely simple tax system for a country like India, because anything else to corruption, evasion, and not to mention litigation. So I am always in favor of radical simplification. And anybody who's willing to help me do this, I'm with you.
Good evening, sir. I'm Ajay Saxena, Commissioner from Bangalore, sir. Want to know whether the pandemic has changed the government's timeline for Indian economy, hitting the $5 trillion mark. Whether we are on track or we will be delayed by some time.
Well, obviously there will be some detour. Obviously, it's a hugely disruptive thing that went, but I think it will not be as much as people think, because I think we will bounce back very strongly in the year 21-22. In fact, even the IMF thinks in real terms we will grow by 11.5%. In nominal terms by 16%. So effectively what we will be doing in next year is effectively going back above where we were before the pandemic hit us. But then obviously beyond that, we will have to keep that momentum up. That is something that, as I said, depends on many things, not the least what happens to the rest of the world, because remember, some part of it will have to depend on our ability to export to the rest of the world, and therefore it depends on what the rest of the world is doing. But I think while there may have been some pushing back of that target, I think while we have officially, it's difficult to put a number on it. I don't think it will be like many commentators said, oh, now it's pushed back by 5 years. Nothing like that. I think maybe a year or something like that. We will catch up with it faster than anybody anticipates. In fact, as I've kept saying, that there are many sectors in the economy which are already back to where they were before COVID and have in fact reached positive growth, whether it's car sales or various other things. And so I think by the first quarter of the next financial year, we will begin to see very high growth rates. And assuming we can maintain that momentum, and assuming that this we continue to be successful in bringing in FDI. By the way, we have been very successful in FDI. Even through this crisis, we have had record FDI coming in. We will be able to carry on this path reasonably strongly. And of course, as I said, we are willing to provide a fiscal support to that. An important aspect, by the way, of our confidence in this is that we have accumulated huge amounts of foreign exchange reserves in the last 1 year, which means that we now have almost $600 billion worth of reserves compared to external debt, including private debt, of something like 560 billion. So we are now a net creditor country to the rest of the world, which allows us in some ways to take some risks on the fiscal side, because the opinions of the global rating agencies doesn't matter very much, because we are a net creditor. All of those things have played in our favor. And then we have done so many reforms in the last few years. We should begin to see some of the benefits of it. And one of them, by the way, was carried out by you. In fact, that's a very good example of that particular, rolling out of GST is a very good example of the kind of philosophical framework that we dealt with, that I was explaining. So before GST existed, India actually did not have a common market. It was easier for Mumbai to trade with Shanghai than for Mumbai to trade with Delhi. So we could never have even dreamt of being a 5 trillion economy, because we were basically made up of half a little small economy here, small economy there, and there was no integration. There was, you can go to the rest of the world and say, oh, India is a great internal market, but there isn't any internal market. It's all divided and sliced up. So it was very obvious we had to introduce some sort of a unified system like a GST. And we also knew that whenever we introduced it, it would be disruptive. Because every country that has introduced GST have had a lot of problems for at least 2 years. So what did we do? Did we spend a lot of time? I mean, everybody told us that, spend another year working out all the bells and whistles and so on. Actually, what we did is quite different. We introduced a system that which sort of worked, but we knew didn't work entirely. And then, having introduced it and knowing it was imperfect, we then fixed it along the way. Now, those of you who have any background in IT will recognize what we did. It's called Agile. It is the only known way of introducing a major reform and doing it quickly. It is admittedly very disruptive, but in fact, it is the only way of doing it. And notice how it is very not so different from what we did with COVID. We had a hedge which we provided the states with the cess pool, the cess, and the promise of providing them with compensation cess. That was the backstop. And then with having provided that, then we moved forward basically by introducing a system and then fixing it along the way. And doing it takes some courage, by the way, because all along the way you get blamed for everything that goes wrong. You will remember being blamed every day for some small thing that went wrong. Just like I had to stand up in front of the media and defend -24% GDP growth rate. And it was not fun doing it during that period. But in the long run, the model begins to fix itself and begins to work much better than these grand master plans that you have, because those grand master plans work very well on your Excel sheet. When you hit reality, it all breaks down. So this is how the GST process worked out. Now, same thing we did with insolvency and bankruptcy code. We introduced it. Initially, it caused all kinds of disruptions in the banking system. But let's be clear, we ended up managing to sell off some massive companies. The bankruptcy codes, NCLT has sold up massive companies like SR. This, you cannot imagine what an improvement this is on the old BIFR system, right? And so the same thing you will discover with, farm laws. A lot of disruption will cause, people are pushing back against it, but in the end, everybody accepts it has to be done at some point, because the current path of system we have is ultimately destroying even the states that are agitating. I mean, Punjab can't keep pumping out groundwater the way it is pumping out groundwater. It's a fact, even they know it. So ultimately, disruptive as it is, this agile system of introducing reforms step by step, iteratively fixing it, means that over time we are actually accumulating enormous amounts of flexibility to the economy. Our economy in another year will be a level different, because we didn't get all the benefits from IBC, GST, labor reform, all these other chota reforms that I mentioned along the way. And so I think the machinery is now beginning to come to a point where it is really going to roll. There is only one area where you still need to do serious structural reform, that is the direct tax code. Those of you here from income tax know what I'm talking about. But with that one big exception, I think other things are getting done. I mean, privatization, now we are no longer, apologetic about it. We are saying, yes, certain areas need to be privatized, and we're going to privatize. Tough if people object to it.
Let me come in and make. Thank you, sir. Just let me come in and make 3 quick points. One is, of course, recently the editorials have been pretty interesting as just after the budget, and the arguments have raised on that India should abandon the path of going the manufacturing route. They sound, in essence, almost like the end of history and the last man kind of a take on that, a variation on that. The presumption, of course, which lies behind it is that, even manufacturing doesn't evolve and there are no new goods which are going to come into the market. I mean, yeah. So my personal opinion is that we should be focusing equally across the 3 sectors and being opportunistic about it. Now, one point that I wanted to make was, though I agree with you, that we should not have the kind of rigidity that we had earlier, maybe in terms of iron cast 5-year plans or these 2-3-year curriculum. But would it not help if we kind of put in some kind of a document in the public space or domain, which would, in a strategic way, indicate the intent where we are going forward, and what are the sectors that we are looking at? You spoke about Singapore, and if I remember correctly, the Ministry of Manpower had, prepared a document which identified about 20 industries for the future that they were looking at. So it would be a good cue from where the private sector could take and start, investing resources in. So that, I suppose, would be an idea which you'd like to comment upon. The third point which I wish to make is, sir, you spoke about the PLI schemes. And what we see here happening different is maybe a whole of the government approach that is happening here. You have the PLI scheme, and one of the favorite things that I keep talking about all the time, along with my colleagues here, the Commissioner of Customs, Shri Baswaraj Nalagave, is that the PLI makes a wonderful combination with one of the new changes that we have in our own customs law, that is the in-bond manufacturing scheme. So to push it together, maybe in the same way the state governments has Department of Industries, or maybe through them, combine them both, let them add whatever they bring to the table and put it across as a package. That would really make a wonderful incentive for new industries to come in. If I have time, I'll come back on the GST element later. So just wanted a quick comment from you on all this.
So I actually agree with all 3 points you're making, and they're actually the same point. But I think you have misunderstood what the Singaporeans are doing, because they actually are using the thinking I am using. By the way, since I have spent many years living in Singapore and was part of their strategic thinking what do you call, think tank, many of those sectors you're talking about are my ideas. But they fundamentally think about this thing differently from the way many people think they think. So let me explain. You see, the point here is this. The future is fundamentally unknown. That is the point, whole point about what I'm saying. Right? It's uncertain. All you are really doing is making some, even the PLI schemes, we don't expect all of them to succeed. We are making some bets. Why you need to make bets? Because nothing ventured, nothing gained, so you make a few bets. Because at least we'll create clusters and some of those things, one of them will work or two of them will work. Others may fail. That is okay. That's why the insolvency and bankruptcy code is part of that, creative destruction. So what we are not trying to do is to guess where it will go. It's possible that, people, for example, say it is the time of manufacturing is over and all of that. That is exactly the Soviet delusion. That, if you put wise men, usually they are men in planning commission, and they very wisely tell you where the world is going, and then you invest in them and you will succeed. Absolutely nothing like that will happen. What you need to do is to create, first of all, the necessary conditions for being able to take risks in random directions. Some of those will succeed, some of them will fail. After all, the rise in the last 500 years, the rise of the West happened how? Basically, Columbus got into a ship and sailed west trying to find India. He found the wrong place. He had no idea where he was going. But he succeeded in changing history. So basically, it is about taking risk, innovation. Some of those things will fail. Right? Same thing, Vasco da Gama basically set sail somewhere going south. He had no idea. He had no clear idea that he had actually found the route to India. He took a calculated guess. So risk-taking and adaptation is ultimately the game, but that requires that you you keep taking risks. Some of those will work. Now, talking about the Singaporeans are doing, that's what the Singaporeans are doing. The Singaporeans have identified some 20 sectors where they'll put some money. But let me tell you, the Singaporeans do not expect more than 5 or 6 of them to work. The genius of Singapore is being able to shut down the failures after they have failed. The problem with India is that autonomous bodies once created in 1950 will continue to suck in money in 2021. And nobody will ever be able to shut down those autonomous bodies. By the way, we have been doing some of it. I've been personally involved in shutting down some autonomous bodies recently. But just as you will know, there are 6 different bodies which promote jute. Why? There are 12 different organizations which promote handicrafts at the central level. Why? Because once a body is created, you can't shut it down. There will be PSUs which we are doing some making useless things which have no known use. We can't shut them down. Now we are privatizing them. We are actually talking. Even there, we so gingerly about it. So the greatness of Singapore is not their ability to find winners, but their ability to take a random bunch of bets. Some of them work and they run with them, and the rest they are ruthless about shutting down. That is basically what we are also attempting to do. Whether we succeed or not, history will tell. But basically, that's what we are attempting to do. And that is the context in which the reforms we are doing. Why are we doing labor reform? Because we don't know which sector will generate the jobs. What we need is that the labor market is flexible enough to allow people to go wherever they will go. So similarly, we want the banking system to be able to take risks. We have a banking system that is completely useless today because it is based on essentially a banking system that is unable and unwilling to take risks because of past sins maybe, but today it is not willing to take risks. Now we cannot have a risk-taking, forward-looking economy with a banking system that is not willing to take risks. Now, why doesn't it take risks? Because by its very nature, public sector banks will have that problem. Because there is each person who's taking a risk, he will not get the returns because public sector salaries are. But if he does something wrong, he will not. How can you have a risk-taking banking system with that skew in there? Incentives wrong. So that is the fundamental problem. We need a financial system that can We need insolvency and bankruptcy code. That's why did we invest in one of the first things this government invested in was an insolvency and bankruptcy code. Why an insolvency and bankruptcy code? Well, because creative destruction means that you will keep shutting down stuff. And this thinking, by the way, is very clearly there in the latest economic service. And since you talked about where are the documents where we put these ideas together, well, read the last 3 economic surveys. Unlike past economic surveys before that, I can claim that at least in my tenure in this position, I have written economic surveys that have clearly influenced policies immediately afterwards. And in this context, again, let me say that, first of all, in this economic survey, we have in fact put in place this whole argument and shown how this problem works. And one of the things we talk about is the problem of shutting down companies. So again, chapter 6, please read it. And it shows how it takes 1,570 days to shut down a company in India when even there is no dispute. If there is a dispute, so then the court will take forever. This is the reason the single biggest reform India needs to do actually is not in the economic front, but in the judicial front. India's judiciary and its inability to enforce contracts on time is now the single biggest constraint to Indian growth. Why? Because the whole point about contract enforcement is the ability to take the ability to resolve unresolvable things that cannot be resolved ex ante. It's only after they go wrong that you have to do something about it, and they have to be then resolved quickly. So again, you can see that my entire thinking process is about how do you deal with a world which is uncertain, changing, evolving, and creating whether it's a judiciary, administrative structures, economic thinking, factor markets, all of it is the whole thing is about how do you deal with randomness of the human inability to deal with this randomness. You'll have to now excuse me, one last question, because I have to actually give another talk in exactly 10 minutes.
Sir, this is Varun Rangaswamy. I'm working as a Deputy Commissioner, sir.
Yeah.
You mentioned about risk-taking, adaptation, and randomness, and creative destruction, and all these things. I want to come back to agriculture, sir. Now, when we look at this agriculture, it's been a traditional and completely alien to all these ideas, and it's like a monolith standing from a long time. And what do we see a farmer as, what role he has to play in this?
A farmer is an entrepreneur first and foremost, and he has to take a bet every year. So if all of the things I'm telling you apply to the farmer first and foremost, and yet we have an economic policy relating to farmers, which is essentially condemns him or her to grow ever more calories through growing cereals. That is basically our agricultural policy. Why did we do it? Well, because maybe in the 60s we were starving and it made sense or whatever, I don't know, green technology. I have radical views on that as well. I don't think it was such a great success as it made out to be. But even assuming that it was a success, today it makes no sense. Because effectively what are we doing? We are growing more and more calories. We are saying agricultural sector should at least grow by 3%. But in fact, our population is now growing at 0.8% a year. And even that growth is because we are living longer, not because we are having more children. The number of children India is producing now is already at just replacement rate. So, and we are urbanizing. So our population is growing at 0.8% and it's slowing. The amount of food we are eating is actually not growing at all because we are now urbanizing and urban people eat less. So in this context, therefore, we don't need those cereals that we are growing. So not surprisingly, FCI has ever more food we have no other use for other than letting it rot and then selling it to the beer companies. That is basically what we are doing. Now look at why this is a pointless path. Because ultimately it will not survive for the simplest reason. One, there is no obvious way of using that product. Now somebody I know will say, why don't we export it? Well, we don't export it because first of all, food prices in the rest of the world for grains is even lower than ours, number one. Secondly, you have to remember exporting food grains is the same as exporting water. And we are a water scarce country. Even more ironically, the part of the country which has this excess food is the more water scarce part of the country, which is Punjab. So what we are doing is pumping out water from the ground, subsidizing that to essentially subsidizing pumping out of water to grow a crop we do not need, by pouring in chemicals that we subsidize in order to poison the earth, to then grow a crop that we don't need, and to have a stubble that we then have to burn. Now think about how completely absurd this is. Now clearly we cannot suddenly now say, oh, we are now going away because we have now to dismantle this whole thing and go on. Because obviously certain structures have been created for the farm sector to be allowed to survive in this. What you need to do is to free them up to do other things, first of all. That is the context in which the farm laws are being created. All we are doing is basically saying that, look, let there be other alternatives that can build up. And frankly, over a period of time, those will become lucrative when people, by their own choice, farmers by their own choice will move on to those things. Because it's not as if farms don't have other things to do. We can grow other things. After all, most of us won't eat more and more rice, but we may eat some more fancy things, like we may eat, I don't know, expensive mushrooms, or some of us may want to eat whatever other things. After all, people eat more things, people will grow wine or whatever it is they want to do. But we can move on to those things which are basically more market determined, but that requires two things. One is that there is a market that determines things. Two, it creates the incentive structure for us to be able to then create people to invest in those things. So we need to create the incentive structure in which these things can happen. Today, as it stands, we can't do it because the whole thing is jammed up, and anybody actually who goes and begins to invest into various things will suddenly be called a hoarder and we'll actually raid it. That's the problem. I'll have to stop now, so because I literally have to go into another conference just now.
Thank you very much, Bala. So is there time for one last question, or we kind of put a hard stop to this?
Sadly, I'll have to put a hard stop. Literally.
Okay, fine. So thank you very much for taking out the time, sir, for being with us. Perhaps again, sometime in the future, we'll have a chance to interact with you again. We would be sharing a small memento with you as a token of our gratitude and appreciation for the time that you've taken out to interact with us. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I have to rush, but I literally have another session starting in 3 minutes.
So, Abhikesh, you are on.
On behalf of IS Custom,
Thank you, Animesh. Thank you.
Karnataka Chapter, I would like to specially thank Amitesh sir. A lot of food of thoughts were being dropped on in the entire session, like creating cluster of activities, taking calculated bets, and a very insightful discussion that we all saw from all our seniors. So thank you, sir, for making it possible. Thank you, the entire IRS Association Karnataka Chapter, for organizing such events like this Xchange 5th edition and making it a successful. And special thanks to all the seniors and all the participants who were there to make this Xchange 5th edition success, for making it such a successful event in terms of huge number of participation and insightful thoughts, creation, food for thought for discussion, sir. So thank you.